What is climate change, its cause, and effects? So, climate change is just a bad term for the destruction of a planet ultimately. The cause, I highlight this because don't fear the wind, because our emissions don't cause climate change. Okay, fossil fuel extraction is the cause of climate change. Uh, and so when you blame something that's not the driving factor, not the reason, you can poke holes in your theory, and you're gonna just not have a very good argument. And even if you do go around solving our problem with emissions and whatnot, it will ultimately not stop climate change because that's not the actual cause. And I can explain that using the effects of what we call climate change. Okay, so like things like the jet streams have crossed the equator, first time in known history. The jet streams are two streams of air currents that go around the planet, and they've broken down and crossed the equator. Emissions don't explain that. Fossil fuel extraction, however, does explain that. Just like, similarly with the northern and southern polar vortex, again, two kind of areas of wind currents around the two poles of the planet, those have broken down. Our emissions don't explain that. Okay, so what's happening here is that like you're taking out a bunch of fossil fuels that are kind of on the upper layers of the Earth's core, and down below that you have highly energized mass. That's actually the reason for our gravity, and it puts out a very strong form of electricity and energy. It's charged mass essentially, so mass repels from itself, and so it's going to naturally form when you have it pressurized down in the core. You're going to have two poles. Those poles are the points at which the energy from the core flows out. I wouldn't want to say the most, but they're maybe the most. They're the two strongest poles. They're the outer layers, essentially, of the Earth's core. And so that's what causes the effects of, we see the wind currents and whatnot. And when we take the oil out of the top layers, that energy is dispersed and it breaks down. And then instead of having the two largest poles, you have poles all over the place. So essentially, layers of the inner core are breaking down. And at the same time, the electromagnetosphere as a result is actually breaking down as well, which is why the jet streams have crossed the equator, why the northern and southern polar vortex have broken down. And you can actually witness that just through the migration of the northern lights. Normally when those charged particles come to Earth, they hit the layers of the upper magnetosphere and then are directed to the poles. And so because those two poles have broken down so much, they're weaker. There's poles all over the place now. And so that's why they've migrated south. They're not just around the North Pole anymore. Again, our emissions doesn't explain that. So there's an increase in meteors. The same thing. Emissions don't explain why there's an increase in meteors and asteroids, whatever you want to classify them as. When these poles break down and these electromagnetic connections go loose into the atmosphere, into space, they're going to naturally pick up on any object that they can. And when they do, because it's an electromagnetic field line, it'll pull in those asteroids and change like their natural flow, because normally it keeps kind of a sphere around the planet, but so you have that happening. And then there's a whole bunch of other things too, like an increase in the occurrences and severity of earthquakes and volcanoes. Again, our emissions don't explain that. What does explain it though is, if, like I said, it's fossil fuel extraction, so you take all the oils and stuff out of there, that mass that wants to naturally repel from itself, it does, and it separates and it comes closer to the surface in areas, and there's not as much pressure and there's not as many layers. Like the oil acts as an insulation barrier, and so it's more volatile as a result. A little bit harder to explain without getting into greater detail and focusing specifically on that. There's changes throughout the solar system, including the orbit of the moon, for example, it's coming closer and further away. Its elliptical orbit has increased. Our emissions don't explain that. Other changes in the solar system, because ultimately the entire solar system is connected. The Earth connected to the sun, and the sun connected to all the planets. So its energies are going to increase to the other planets. And we see changes to Jupiter's red eye, for example. The winds have sped up. The eye itself has narrowed because it's pulling more. There's a stronger current going through there. Emissions don't explain that. In so many other things, there's local areas of droughts and flooding. So why doesn't our emissions explain that? It doesn't do that. If you have an area of drought and then an area of high flooding, and they're kind of coinciding together, different things will change that a bit. But again, that's Earth's core energies are repelling from itself and creating these systems that are results for that. And that has to do also a bit more complicated. It breaks down to the geological structures of the Earth's crust and mantle. And overall, and as we put all these gases and emissions into our atmosphere, at the same time, our atmosphere is actually shrinking and getting smaller. So how does emissions explain that, right? Loss of core energy through fossil fuel extraction, however, does explain that, which kind of sums up everything, a lot of at least what I've been saying here in this video. So I think it's really important to understand these things so that your arguments can get better, and you can't, and once science is ultimately resolved, or at least to a place where you can't debunk it, you're going to have more action on these subjects. You're going to actually go around solving the problem itself instead of, just planting trees, which is great, but it won't stop climate change or save this planet. So thanks. Talk to you guys later.